Good morning, everybody. First of all, just to thank Matt and Fóra Mishka for inviting me today to speak to you a little bit about this particular issue of ecosystem management. Strangely, my first few slides are really to put my last slide in context. Then I'm going to park them, and then we're going to get back to the first few slides at the end, because I think, particularly for the younger people in the audience, it's important to understand this stuff is not new. So that top report there that Connor was kind enough to do for us, that report dates back to 2013. So in the context then of the middle part of the slide there, that's a talk I gave in 2009 to the Royal Irish Academy on climate change, using salmon as a surrogate to show people the potential consequences of it. On the right then is the first marine climate change report that I co-authored with colleagues in the Marine Institute. So again, just emphasising the fact that this is, in essence, a decade to a decade and a half ago in terms of these particular changes. I know now why I'm so weird, because this is a big climate change event that, again, we saw some years ago in a research station I used to manage in County Mayo. And what you see on the right-hand side there is 55 millimetres of rain in 2 hours. So we lost 3 bridges and we had 2 landslides in that one single event. And that gave us a very clear idea as to what we were facing into, again, 15 years ago. We had a situation now where we have to try and get communities involved, and we have to try and understand what's happening. And I'm going to talk a little bit about lakes because of an opportunity we got through LawPro, through Bernie, to actually do some citizen science on lakes. And the first thing we did was we sent out questionnaires. And the anglers that you see here from Lough Conn, they had nailed this. All we had to do was, as scientists, was to move in and verify what they had already found. And the changes that are happening in our lake systems are actually quite profound. And I think that's something that we have to understand. This is something that's a lot more fundamental than perhaps we might have thought had been the case. Strangely, what we were looking at were these little creatures, which I dearly love. These are mayflies. I did my PhD centuries ago on mayflies. I was asked to go back and look again in terms of some of the changes that were happening to these little creatures in the bed of the lake. What you have here is what mayflies love, which is nice, sticky marl. So they make their little homes, their little burrows in this sticky marl. And you might think, what has that got to do with climate change? Well, what our anglers had found was that there was big change happening. Suddenly, they were beginning to see completely natural plants. We're not talking at the moment about invasive plants, but completely natural plants starting to invade sections of Lough Conn. We found the same thing on Lough Corrib as well. And what was happening was, as a consequence of that, was that the sediments in the lake were actually changing. So what you see there is very fine silt. And because the fine silt has appeared, the mayflies were out of there. They weren't having any of it. So they left as a consequence of that. And this was on quite a big scale in terms of some of the bays that we actually looked at. And these are the beautiful plants. You wouldn't see these as nasty and invasive and things to worry about. But very big acreages of the lake were now changing as a consequence, we think, of probably climate change. But I'd been aware of this for a number of years. I did a podcast some years ago with a friend of mine who had seen these changes in Irish rivers. I had seen this happen in some of the smaller lakes, but I hadn't been aware that it was also happening in some of the bigger lakes. You can see the silt, completely natural. That is lots and lots of lovely creatures. That's going to feed trout in there, but the mayflies have disappeared. So the point I'm making is that the sediment is changing, and that what we're seeing now is something very different. We're also seeing extraordinary adaptations. We're seeing a situation now where these little mayflies that we thought were really sensitive little creatures, they're making their homes in the new environment. So what we have here is peat that we found in Lough Conn, probably very old peat, that's quite calcified and gnarly. And the mayflies are using this, rather than expending energy trying to make burrows, they're living in this gnarly peat, which we would never have expected. The most extraordinary thing we found, which is something that I first saw in Lough Erne about 2015, so this may be the cause, or part of the cause, for this increase in terms of the spread of the plants. So these are zebra mussels, but these are zebra mussel shells. And what we found in 2015 was that amongst the zebra mussel shells and in the empty shells were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mayfly nymphs. So you would have thought that if these are excluded from the bay as a result of changing conditions in the bay, that they'd be lost. No. They have found a way to adapt. So again, what this is showing us is that these are very, very different changes. These are very quick changes. They're happening at a very profound level. And what we're seeing is that the actual physical structures of these lakes are actually changing. So I was very lucky in my project to have with me a guy called Ross Finlay, who's a really, really good diver. And a lot of this stuff is available on YouTube. So Ross went down with his little GoPro, and we were absolutely amazed at what we found. The bed of those big lakes is entirely different to anything I could have imagined. And I've spent my life putting dredges and grabs down into these sediments. But what's happening is actually very, very different to what I could possibly have imagined. So they're just the little mayfly nymphs that are living in the bed of Loch Sheelan, and particularly in these mounds of zebra mussel shells. So you have this very, very strange interaction. This interaction of non-native species interacting with native species, interacting with the actual sediments in the lake itself. So just think for a moment about what we were told a little earlier on, particularly that comment that was made about the release of phosphorus. So if you're changing the actual sediments that are in these lakes, or if these elements are changing, you need to be conscious of that, and you need to be interlinking these things. This is basically the theme of what we're about today. How do we interlink this? So it's as complicated, or more complicated indeed, in a loch system as it is in a river system. We also have other invasive species that we have to take into account. So these are the Asian clams, another visitor. We have the quagga mussel. The quagga mussel is just beginning to appear and beginning to spread. Unlike the zebra mussel, rather than living on hard surfaces, they live on the soft surfaces. They may actually affect some of the creatures that we're now seeing invading some of the areas that are changing in the lakes. So this is the zebra mussel at the top, quagga mussel on my right here, and then the zebra mussel. So what does all of this mean? I would argue today that we don't actually know what it means. I think we are still funding people to go and be specialists. We're funding people to know all about trout. We're funding people to know all about the actual plankton that are in the lakes. We're funding people to look at the water quality. That's all really, really important. But we need to put this stuff together. So what we have seen in terms of what Conor presented to us earlier, in terms of the climate change, we also have these bigger shifts. We have these regime shifts. And certainly I'm very conscious of the 1989 regime shift, a very sudden change in terms of this, in terms of the climate. We're seeing the effects of that now. You'll have seen the publicity in terms of our Atlantic salmon. So I work a lot on Atlantic salmon. That regime shift has had a profound effect on Atlantic salmon since 1989. Then we have the effects that occur as a result of a single individual event, like that 55 millimeters I showed you at the very beginning. As Conor mentioned earlier, in terms of Spain, we have 300 millimeters in one day in some areas of Spain. So these are very major changes. And adaptation and mitigation, what does that look like for a loch? Not for a single element of the loch, but for the whole loch itself. What services will our lochs offer in time to come, whether it's in the context of health, water quality, recreation? What are these changes? What do they mean in the totality of the lake itself? And I would argue that in terms of changes in biodiversity and changes in these lochs up to 2080, we have to up our game in freshwater. Now, for 10 years, I was a director in the Marine Institute, as I mentioned. Across the country in Galway, sitting in the Marine Institute offices, we have some of the best ecosystem scientists in the world. Have we ever asked them to come and teach us how to understand the totality of our lochs? I don't think we have. And I think that's understandable because we're so driven by the patterns, by the way we actually move in terms of looking at these things. And we reinforce our own views in terms of how we actually look at these things. But I would strongly argue that in a world of big data, in a world of AI and modelling, that we should be challenging ourselves. We should have at least 2 or 3 meetings a year where anyone that's involved with our lock systems would meet with these ecosystem scientists, would engage with our marine colleagues. This has proven to be really difficult in the marine world. It's highly controversial. But I would suggest that if we don't look at this in terms of looking at these fundamental changes, that we're fooling ourselves in terms of being able to actually act on some of the wonderful suggestions that we got earlier in terms of mitigation. Thank you very much.